I'm going to be looking at aspects of Romani history, ethnicity, and identity. My name is Dr. Adrian Marsh, and this is the Barvalipe Masterclass. The next stage of the long march west of the Romani people begins with the movement beyond the boundaries of the Byzantine Empire and into the lands of southeastern Europe. When Romani people arrived first in this region, they often found themselves subject to being enslaved by the local nobles and the princes. The reasons behind this enslavement are often debated in Romani Studies. There has been an ongoing discussion between Romani activists and Romani historians as to the origins of Romani slavery, particularly in the Romanian lands, in Wallachia and Moldavia. What is most often taken into account as a causal factor is the arrival of the Ottomans and their conquest of many of the territories of Western Anatolia and the Balkans in the early 14th century. However, it's possible to find evidence of Romani slavery earlier than that. In fact, at the end of the 13th century, there are strong indications, documentation that exists. The arrival of Romani people in the Serbian lands, what is modern-day Serbia and Kosovo, is where we find late 13th century documentation that the practice of enslaving Romani people was already in progress, long before the Ottoman Empire emerged. Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, the practice became embedded through the 14th century and was enshrined in laws that captured and enslaved, locked into an economic system, Romani people for many centuries to come. Many Romanian scholars and researchers would suggest that this was a continuation of earlier practices of enslaving peasantry. However, the feudal system was one that was built upon peasant serfdom. And serfdom was a very different category to slave. Roma slaves were enslaved because of their race, because of their ethnicity. The reasons for their enslavement can be found in the continuing wars and troubles that engulfed the region during the emergence of the Seljuk Emirate in Anatolia, pushing populations westward, and along with them, disease. There were repeated episodes of what was called plague at the time, probably typhus, and these plagues decimated the populations of the Balkans on a regular basis. Faced with the problem of labour on their lands, the boyars and princes were forced to seek other solutions. In order to provide enough labour, they would then try and tie individuals, families, whole communities to the land. The only available labour that they had were those people who'd been protected to some extent from the ravages of typhus. These were the Romani people who practiced a series of pollution taboos, who practiced the kind of code that protected them to some extent from disease. The enslavement of Romani people under these conditions was one that was driven by economic necessity. However, its racial basis was markedly different from slavery elsewhere in the region. Serfdom, as I said earlier, was a condition which the peasants existed under in the feudal system. Roma slavery was racial. It was based on ethnicity. It was based upon the possibility of tying a particular ethnicity to the land, forcing them to labour on that land, and making that condition inherited. In this context, Romani slavery in the Romanian lands in the 14th century is much closer to the later manifestation of racial slavery of African people in the United States and the Caribbean in the 16th and 17th centuries. Both were economically based. Both were driven by a desire to tie labour to the land, and both were racial and inherited. One of the most important tasks for Romani historians of Romani history is to challenge the hegemonic discourse around inserting Romani people and the history of Romani migration into the narrative of the European nation-state. This approach ignores important Romani experiences in other territories, other polities, and other lands. One of those polities is the Ottoman Empire. And aside from a few references in more general and established histories, or particularly specialized papers delivered in sometimes quite obscure journals, there is very little that relates to the history of Romani people in the Ottoman Empire. Either in the classical period, the period from 1300 to 1600, or in the period after that, from 1600 to 1800. There are more studies that relate to the period of the 19th century and the early 20th century, but much of the early history of Romani people in the early Ottoman Empire is absent from the record. Many Romani people were part of the Ottoman armed forces, the navy and the janissaries. They were often auxiliary soldiers commanded by Crimean Tartars or Alevi officers. Others were part of the more formal structure of the Ottoman army, such as the Meter, the Ottoman military band. This led the janissaries into action on many occasions and was seen as part of that surge into Europe that was so successful in the 15th, 16th and early 17th century. Other Ottoman Romanis were employed as smiths in the tersane, in the dockyard. And one of the greatest concentrations of Romani people working in the armed forces was in tophane, in the arsenal, chain making, gun making, cannon making, and powder making. Famously, the area around tophane still exists and is still the centre of a small Romani community in Istanbul. Other examples of the integration of Romani people into Ottoman society are in the guilds. The guild system in the Ottoman Empire guaranteed that groups of craftsmen and artisans passed on their skills and heritage to their children, maintaining production and increasing labour over time. Ottoman Romanis fitted into the guild system in a number of particular areas. Obviously, smithery. Less obviously, basket making. Basket making was an aspect of the Ottoman military machine. Fetching and carrying anything required woven baskets to be able to do so. The sepetçiler, a community that still exists in Turkey, were those specialists who produced baskets not only for the military but for wider public consumption. The coppersmiths, the kalaycı, tinsmiths, these were people who were also essential to the Ottoman military machine. Again, they were the people who would supply everything that was based on metalwork outside of weaponry such as cannons and rifles. Furthermore, the entertainers in Ottoman society were also organized in guilds. Guilds of dancers, particularly male dancers, dancing boys called koçek, from the Persian meaning small. These guilds of dancers were highly represented during major festivals, such as the circumcision of the Sultan's sons, or during the festivities following Ramazan. These became so widely spread and so intimately connected with the Romani experience in the Ottoman Empire that even when the dance guilds were made up of Armenians or Jews, they were still considered to be çingeneler, the Ottoman word for gypsies. In this way, although there was never an equality between Ottoman Romanis and society at large, there was still enough of a parity that the Romani experience in the Ottoman Empire really was very different to that in Europe in the same period. It is only with European penetration and European ideas coming from European travellers from the 18th century onwards that attitudes in the Ottoman Empire significantly change. Disparaging associations between Çingeneler and negative stereotypes about unreliability, thievery, lying, etc., start to pervade Ottoman society in ways that hadn't been in existence previously. So it is only when Europeans bring their ideas about their gypsies into the Ottoman Empire that we see a significant shift, a significant deterioration in the relationship between Ottoman Romanis and the Ottoman state. One final point about the Ottoman experience for Romani people relates to culture and the arts and performance. There are actually no records of Romani people performing in public in the Byzantine Empire in terms of music and dance. The main occupations, as I suggested earlier, were around fortune-telling and acrobatics. Whilst there may well have been private and communal performances of music for community weddings, etc., there were no public performances. There are, in fact, no records of Romani music and dance in Europe until the 1520s in Scotland. However, in the Ottoman Empire, this is where we find early records of Romani people performing at the courts of the sultans and pashas from the 1350s. It seems that there, the identity and the interlinking of the notion of gypsy people being intimately connected with music and dance is forged. It becomes one of the mainstays of Romani identity in the Ottoman Empire. It is an important part of the economy for Romani people and remains so to the present day in Turkey. But more importantly, perhaps, this is the point at which the image becomes welded. Romani people become deeply associated with dance and with music, and the music that they become most associated with has a highly orientalized factor in it. So this is the point at which we can see another component of Romani identity coming into being. The 14th century in the Ottoman Empire has an enormous impact on the future culture, arts and performance of Romani people. One of the most important tasks for Romani historians is to address the issue of how Romani people have been inserted into the narrative of the European nation-state. It's clear that Romani history, as it has been written predominantly by non-Romani people, seeks to place Romani people in the context of the emergence of nation-state identities in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. In this context, Romani people become the significant other. One might say English people become English because they are not Gypsy. There is this role of the other in the emergence of nation-state identities, and this is the one that has been focused upon by many people, many scholars and researchers in Romani Studies. However, it's as well to remember that the European region is not the only region by any means where Romani people exist, and that their experiences across the rest of the world are as important as those that took place in Europe. This Eurocentric bias is one that we need to address, and we need to incorporate much wider experiences of Romani people from the Americas, Australasia, and from the Muslim lands. The movement into Europe began with shifting out of the borders of the Byzantine Empire in the 14th century. From then on, the Romani people as Egyptians began to be recognized in a number of contexts. The first was as pilgrims, as apostates, as people who were claiming Christianity was their new religion and that they had previously been Muslims. Now, many sources treat this as some kind of elaborate fabrication. This is often referred to as the Great Trick in modern Romani histories. But in fact, of course, Romani people were, in a real sense, apostates. They'd been part of the Islamic power state, the Ghaznavid Empire. They'd moved from that empire into Byzantium, an Orthodox Christian state, and therefore they'd adopted Christianity. This in itself, of course, under Islam, is apostasy and is an extremely significant act. Back in the medieval period, apostasy was punishable by death. So when Romani pilgrims claimed in front of the Pope and the Holy Roman Empire in the 14th century that they were pilgrims seeking redemption and that their migrations were an act of penitence, they were telling the truth. There was nothing tricky about this. The migrations of Romani people into Europe took place over a period of 3 or 4 centuries in total, beginning in the early 14th century and continuing onwards. Some of our earliest references are from city chronicles, where Romani people as large groups arrived outside the boundaries of cities and asked if they could stay within the environs of major conurbations. They were treated by the city burghers as legitimate pilgrims and penitents, led by counts and dukes. We have records of Duke Andrew, for example, arriving in Paris in the 1420s and being treated as a duke. Clearly, the social structure of Romani communities at this point was one that was widely accepted by the wider feudal system. However, through the 16th century, these larger groups began to atomize, to break down into smaller units as a result of persecution and discrimination, and a desire not to attract attention from the authorities. It is during the early 16th century when we start to see the beginnings of punitive legislation against Gypsy people. In Tudor England, for example, in 1536, a law was passed against Egyptians, counterfeits, sturdy beggars, vagrants, and masterless men. This law was deliberately aimed at those people who were mobile in Tudor society. Now, it's often suggested that the law was much more wide-ranging than being a deliberate act of anti-Gypsyism. The suggestion is that with the transition from feudalism to capitalism, this displaced many other people and forced them into an itinerant existence, not just the Gypsies. However, the legislation makes it clear that it was primarily aimed at counterfeit Egyptians, i.e. the Gypsies. And of course, at this point in time, what were the Egyptians have now become the Gypsies. The word itself has become contracted. These laws were repeated across Europe and across time. Throughout the 16th century, we see these laws being repeated again and again in an attempt to control, to expel, to export, to deport, and to otherwise contain what was increasingly seen as the unacceptable presence of Romani people in emerging nation-states in Europe. Some of our documentary evidence comes from chronicles that were written by scholars who were seeking to explain the arrival of these new Gypsy pilgrims, as they were often described. From the German lands, for example, we have Münster's Cosmographia in 1554. His work is one of the earliest representations of Gypsy people as fortune tellers. It's clear from woodcuts and engravings contained within the Cosmographia that we see people who are dressed in what is effectively Byzantine clothing, a flattened turban, a cloak that falls from one shoulder, a long underskirt. These things are very much part of what was everyday Byzantine dress. But of course, in medieval and early modern Europe, they were seen as very different. It's also true that there was an identification with Greekness in some fashion, a misunderstanding that the Romani people were Greek in origin or spoke a version of Greek. That's one of the references we find in Shakespeare, for example, in As You Like It, when one of the characters, Jacques, repeats "Dukdame, Dukdame, Dukdame," and when asked what he means by that, he says it is a Greek invocation to draw fools into a circle. Now, Shakespeare obviously understood that his audience would recognize that, both as coming from the Egyptians and as something that they would perceive to be associated with that community, fortune-telling. It's also clear that this is a corrupted reference to actual Romani language, Dugdame being a corrupted form of I tell fortunes, I tell fortunes. It's likely that Shakespeare, as a travelling player, had heard Gypsy people calling out in markets and fairs, saying that they would tell fortunes for people. So the fact that Shakespeare includes this in one of his plays tells us that the familiarity of Romani people for playwrights, authors, scholars, researchers, and ordinary Tudors and Elizabethans was widespread. These early attempts to document the Romani people in Europe within the nation-states were followed up by a more insistent attempt to explain them. Now, one of the most interesting things in the mid-16th century is an attempt to capture some of the language, or Egypt speak, as Dr. Andrew Boord in Oxford tried to do so. Within his list of words that he accounted for are recognisably modern Romani words. Towards the end of the 16th century and into the 17th century, more and more treatises dealt with the Egyptians or the Gypsies. And they sought further and further to explain their origins and where they were from. Some of the most outlandish explanations suggested that Romani people were from the moon or from inside the planet, i.e. people who existed within the Earth's core. However, many other explanations were also posited. It was not very often that Romani people were themselves asked, and their voice, aside from the occasional appearance in things like Andrew Boord's collection of Egypt speech, was infrequently heard. There are some occasions when particular Romani people appear. For example, in the treatment of the King of Scotland whilst he was in France arranging his marriage with one of the daughters of the French king. There is an Egyptian healer who is quite clearly referred to in the documentation. There is even a pencil sketch of her. Gypsies in Scotland through the 16th and 17th centuries were relatively well treated as a consequence of this particular intervention by a Romani healer with a Scottish monarch. One of the other consequences of the arrival of Romani people in Western Europe was their spread through the lands of northwestern Europe, such as Scotland, and thence into Denmark and Scandinavia. So we can see a pattern of migration emerging here, which means that by the end of the 16th century and the early 17th century, Romani people are widely spread from in the south, Spain, to the north of Sweden and Finland. During the 17th century and the 18th century, the tide turned. What was initially an enchantment with new Gypsy pilgrims, almost a welcome, actually became hostile. More and more punitive laws were passed across European states. And in the German lands, for example, the infamous Gypsy hunts were undertaken. There were many more examples of Gypsies being arrested, detained, tortured, summarily executed, or in Spain, for example, rounded up into concentration camps. By the middle of the 17th century, during the time of the wars of religion, we have a picture emerging whereby Romani people have become smaller and smaller units, defensive units, often travelling heavily armed. We see this particular image of the Gypsies in engravings by Jacques Callot, La Bohemienne. It depicts what must have been an image that was recognisable, groups of Romani people travelling both on horseback and in wagons and on foot. And by this time they've adopted a much more European form of dress, even if somewhat extravagant. Large feathers adorn hats. The hats are extremely broad. There is an idea behind all of this, that Romani people have become defensible units. They may even have been partaking in the wars themselves as mercenaries, paid troops, with captains leading them. It's often said that Romani people have not participated in war, but this is actually a fallacy. Romani people were born out of the pursuit of conflict in the Ghaznavid Empire. Whilst there is no evidence to suggest that they made up part of the Byzantine forces, they were certainly part of the Venetian forces fighting the Ottomans, and conversely, They were a very important part of the Ottoman military machine, as I described earlier. In the middle of the 16th century, we find further records, of gypsies participating in conflicts in Britain, in Scandinavia, and in Scotland. And in the middle of the 17th century, there are certainly enough indications to suggest that Romani people were mercenaries in the wars of religion, fighting for whoever would pay them. By the end of the 17th century, a new kind of Europe had emerged. The wars of religion across Europe had taken their toll. The English Revolution, likewise. What had come about as a result of all of these conflicts were much more like modern nation states than had existed previously. Romani people no longer fitted in. Romani people at this point began to be deliberately targeted. And the opening up of the New World in the early part of the 16th century now allowed places where people could be deported to in the 17th. There is a kind of second wave of Romani slavery that comes into being in this period. For example, transportation and deportation to the New World, both to Latin America and North America and the Caribbean colonies, was regularly undertaken. Romani people were transported either as indentured servants, which was for a period of time, or as slaves and prisoners, which was for life. Many of the Romani communities that exist in Australasia or in the Americas stem from this very period. And this second wave of Romani slavery is one that's very rarely taken into account. The early 18th century saw a renewed interest in the origins of Romani people, partly as a result of the Oriental language studies that were going on in Europe at the time, and a recognition that the language that Egyptians spoke, that the Gypsies spoke, had its origins and ancestry in Hindu and Sanskrit. Another reason why there was a renewed interest in the origins and ancestry of Romani people was, of course, the Enlightenment. During that period, we find more and more interest in collecting data, in cataloguing gypsies as part of a wider colonial exercise, in providing a taxonomy of race and ethnicity that fitted in with the imperial projects being undertaken by European nation-states in the Africas, in India, and in the Americas. Romani people were probably first colonized before any other group of people. And things that were understood by scholars and researchers about Romani people and ascribed to them in terms of notions of blackness, in terms of negative associations, were later transposed onto other communities such as Africans, native peoples in the Americas, and in other colonies. Here we find the associations between gypsies and data collection in their first appearance. Encyclopedists wanted to collect as much as possible in terms of information about Romani families, Romani heritage, in order to establish bloodlines, in order to fit into notions of race and ethnicity that were rapidly developing. By the end of the 18th century, the fascination with bloodlines and what became eugenics in the 19th century was in full swing. Theorists like Edward Long, who were writing in the Caribbean in the 1770s, were developing notions of race and hierarchies of ethnicity that would fit into the imperial project at its most expansive and at its most structured. Romani people were seen as a degraded form of Aryans. They were seen as the lowest community within the hierarchy of races, below, in fact, everybody else. Despite the Aryan heritage as it was described, a notion that was originally applied only to language, but then became transferred into notions of race and ethnicity, despite this heritage, it wasn't long before the identification of Romani people as less than, as non-humans, became very much part of the thinking. From the mid-19th century onwards, we find the establishment of European states' offices for the containment and control of Romani people. Most notoriously, of course, in the German states and principalities, is the setting up of the offices for the Gypsy nuisance. By the time of the unification of Germany under Bismarck in the late 19th century, these had become a central part of the German bureaucracy. They were deliberately targeting Romani people, the Sinti and Roma of Germany, in order to build up a comprehensive police picture, which was then used to both arrest, to harass, and to significantly limit the movement of Romani peoples through the German lands. However, it was not only in these territories where these kind of activities took place. All across Europe, attempts were made to control Romani movement, to seek to stop them, to settle them. And in some countries, this took an even more extreme form. In the Scandinavian lands, for example, people were forcibly colonized and settled into particular camps where they were stripped of their Romani identity and forced to speak the national language. Children were taken away from them, often led by the church, and raised to be non-Romani Europeans. The attempt to breed new Hungarians in the Austro-Hungarian Empire under the Empress Maria Theresa in the late 18th century was further extended during the 19th century and more forcibly implemented among a much wider group of European states. The agenda became one of control and eradication of Romani culture and language. Control was about limiting movement, but the eradication of language and culture was about a slow cultural genocide, one which would remove Romani people from the European map forever. By the late 19th century, with the ideas of Francis Galton and others, eugenics had become the popular science topic and was used to reinforce notions of race and ethnicity and hierarchies of peoples, with white Europeans at the top and Romani people at the bottom, black Africans just above them and Indians above them. These notions were to colour both the early 20th century experience of Romanis in Europe and what was one of the darkest periods in Romani history after the First World War into the Nazi racial state of the 1930s and the Second World War of 1939 to 1945. The Romani Holocaust, or Paraimos, as it is called in the Romani language, is one of the darkest events in Romani history. Between 500,000 and 1.5 million Roma and Sinti were murdered by the fascists and their allies between 1939 and 1945. The Paraimos is often called the Forgotten Holocaust, and with good reason. Roma and Sinti communities rarely feature in general histories of the Holocaust, and the suffering of Romani people in the destruction camps, in the death camps of Auschwitz-Birkenau, Chełmno and others, is rarely put into words. Survivors from Roma communities are often cast off as liars and fantasists, and those seeking compensation were rarely recognized, or the process was made so difficult as to actually negate any effective compensation being awarded. One of the key issues about the Romani Paraimos is the idea that there was a difference in treatment from the Nazis towards Jews and Romani people. The argument is often made that Roma and Sinti were treated as criminals and antisocials, and that the Jews were persecuted on the basis of their race. Actually, there is significant evidence that demonstrates that both groups were treated on the basis of their racial identity, and that the persecution of Roma and Sinti, the destruction of those communities, was based on the fact that they were perceived to be a race by the Nazis. This is a monument to the Romani Paraimos here in Bucharest, and it's almost a metaphor for the fact that most people don't know about this event as part of the wider Holocaust history. Most people in this city don't know what this particular monument is for. They don't understand the significance of its circularity. They have no idea about who it represents. And in a sense, it's not through deliberate prejudice, but through ignorance of the event itself and through the commemoration of that event, that this monument languishes. It becomes uncared for, unkempt. It becomes dirty and mistreated. And that in itself, as I said, is a metaphor for the wider issue of the Romani Paraimos. One of the tasks that Romani historians and activists have undertaken over the last 30 years is to document some of those survivors' stories. One particular story concerns a Hungarian Roma woman who was incarcerated in 1942 in one of the death camps. When that camp was liberated in 1945 by Allied troops, she fled from those troops, fearing that they were more people who were going to abuse and torture her. As she was running, she was heard to cry out by other Romani people, "These are more people from the devil, these are more of the devil's soldiers." For her, there was no significant difference. These were uniforms, and the people who'd incarcerated her had mistreated her and wore uniforms too. Despite the fact that they came with blankets and medicine and food, for Romani people, when they were liberated, they were faced with another group of soldiers. And for them, these were just as terrifying as the Nazis who'd abused and tortured them beforehand. One of the most important things about survivors' stories from Roma and Sinti is making them accessible to the widest possible community. Recently, a survivor's story from a Swedish Roma woman was made into a graphic book. The story tells of how she and her family were captured in the Polish woods and were incarcerated in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and how she as a small girl watched the destruction of her entire family, parents, brothers, sisters, grandparents. Her reluctance to tell her story to her grandchildren is something that she describes at the beginning of the book, how she did not want to tell them, why that strange tattoo on her arm was there and what it signified. But they persuaded her because they wanted to know her story. And eventually she told it to them and wrote it down, and then it became converted into a graphic book. This is now one of the most accessible ways in which young Romani people can find out about the previous history of our communities. And it's extremely important that these things are not forgotten, that these stories from survivors don't disappear when the survivors themselves pass on. There is another aspect to the Romani Paraimos, and it's one that's not often thought about or even recognized, even by Romani people themselves. And that is the other side of this story. There were many Romani and Traveller service people who fought in the Second World War for their country, particularly from the United Kingdom. And some of those were in the position of actually documenting and recording their own experiences upon discovery of the death camps. There were Romani and Traveller servicemen, Gypsy and Romani and Traveller servicemen, who were part of the push to liberate those camps. That side of the history is rarely talked about, and it's something that is absent from the memories and something that is absent. And yet there is a contribution, a rarely recognized contribution of Romani and Traveller service people to the Second World War. Only recently has that contribution been recognized, when in 2016 a group of Romani and Traveller service people were allowed to march during the commemorations held in London on November the 11th. Many local Romani NGOs have also been at work across Europe and into Anatolia. There are an enormous number of local Romani organisations working for their own communities, but also on the wider platform of seeking Romani emancipation and equality. They may pursue things differently in different places. One of the most significant aspects of this new Romani political mobilization has been to provide a basis for the future of Romani communities, seeking equality before the law and under the Constitution. This lecture has been an attempt to look at some aspects of Romani history in more detail, and as such, I hope it's been useful to people. But I would always encourage young Romani scholars and researchers to take up more of these issues in Romani histories, to broaden the scope of what we consider to be Romani history, to look beyond the borders of Europe. What is the experience, for example, in Central Asia amongst the Luli, the Mugats and others? What is the experience across the Middle East for the Damari-speaking peoples? These are questions yet to be answered, and I hope that young Romani scholars will take these questions up and others and look further to write a more full picture and encourage you to take these things to a place where we can actually start to see a truly universal Romani history being written by Romani people themselves. Thank you.